The recent aesthetic turn in international relations has brought alternative modes of knowledge production into the realm of legitimacy in academia. Works of personal narrative, speculative fiction, and visual art, like photography and film, can be included in an aesthetic approach to understanding politics. In the following video, we will define the aesthetic turn and contextualize this approach in our study of peace and conflict. But before we jump into aesthetics, let's take a moment to ground ourselves in our understanding of peace. I'll give you the short answer first. Peace is the condition of being free from violence. Well, you might ask, what then does it mean to be free from violence? If this sounds like a circular definition, that's because it is. John Galtung describes the definition of peace as obscurum per obscurius, which is the explanation of a difficult concept by means of an even more confusing concept. Drawing from these conclusions, we can argue that there is peace when we are free from violence to our bodies and minds, when we do not experience threat from individuals, nor from an institution, when there is nothing preventing a person from achieving their full potential. That is where we find peace. But what does peace actually look like? Well, there are a lot of things that it is, and a lot of things that it isn't. And therein lies the difficulty of representation. The problem of representation lies at the heart of the aesthetic turn. Now, why do we call it a turn? The use of the verb indicates that there is a movement away from something, and that this something is the idea that we can come to know, to grasp reality through its objective representation. This idea is known as mimesis, and it is this concept that the aesthetic turn is turning away from. You see, the general consensus of what constitutes a production of academic work has been set squarely within social scientific conventions. This often privileges the scientific method, which assumes that there is a singular, objective truth that can be logically deciphered and reproduced through iterative experiments. To make this more concrete, one of the most well-known and respected political paradigms gets its name from this assumption that there is a real essence to the world that can be uncovered through the observation of political phenomenon. This political theory is called realism. Circling back to what I described earlier as the problem of representation, the aesthetic approach takes issue with this notion that we can objectively know or engineer political realities. The problem with representation, through both a mimetic and aesthetic approach, is that representation will never replace reality. Even this video is simply a representation, a window into scenes that I've experienced, but it'll never fully capture the whole picture. What did the forest smell like? Was I alone? Was the wind blowing a chill? Could all this be true at once? And does it even matter if it doesn't directly relate to the real question at hand? Even more important, if proponents of the aesthetic approach argue that mimesis and aesthetics are both entangled with the idea that representation isn't reality, then what's the difference between them? Well, the difference lies in how they approach the subjectivity of representation. While mimesis is based on the belief that some representations can be objective through the gathering and synthesis of data into legitimate forms of knowledge like a graph in an academic paper, aesthetics leans into the assumption that representations are rife with subjectivities. Even in mimetic productions, those taking an aesthetic approach would argue that the decision to focus on a specific line of inquiry is based on a subjective bias as to which question is worthy of pursuit. What kind of data was deemed useful, and which kinds were not? This decision can be understood as an example of the subjectivities alive within the mimetic approach to representation. Instead of denying the presence of subjectivity, the aesthetic approach proceeds with the acknowledgement that subjective and even fictional knowledge is useful to understanding reality, and that perhaps if we accept the messiness of the world, we might get even closer to the unknown. Now I know what we're all thinking. That feels very obscurum per obscurius, does it not? How can we claim to clarify the real by leaning into the subjective? Well, for starters, it has been scientifically proven that humans cannot escape subjective representations. Sounds like a fabrication? Well, perhaps that's because our brains are currently building a representation of the world through bite-sized pieces of sensory data that can only approximate the material plane that we exist on. In other words, everything we think we know, see, feel, do exists through the narrow cognitive bandwidth of our tiny human brains. If we think that we can escape the reality of our foundational subjectivity, then that too is an aspirational belief. Drawing our circular reasoning to a circular close, the themometic approach disregards the latent subjectivity of reality. Then the aesthetic approach, which places value in knowledge productions considered unacademic, may offer a unique entry point into understanding an equally amorphous condition like peace. According to the aesthetic approach, we, as social scientists, shouldn't be afraid of the subjectivities of our work. We are human, and humans leave a trace. No matter how hard we may try to hide it in our logic and language, we cannot reproduce reality. Not really. The aesthetic turn seeks to argue that reality just is, and we who experience it do so uniquely.